It didn't take long for larger schools to notice what Clayton West was doing at Windham High School. They came calling with offers of more pay and better facilities. West moved first to Navarre High School in Stark County, and then he moved to Hubbard High School in Mahoning County. And I just found out 5 minutes ago that Clayton coached at Hubbard High School until 1979. But, finally, Windham had facilities to match the other schools in the county. In 1952, the Bombers got a new gym. 50 years later, it's still the home court of our modern-day Bombers, who will be kicking off their season any day now. Unfortunately, the basketball coach who replaced Clayton West, Lawrence Snyder, inherited a team depleted by height by graduation. And the miraculous 25-1 season was followed by a dismal 2-13 record. Lawrence Snyder must have seen the handwriting on the wall, because the last Windham saw of him was a cloud of dust heading in the direction of Idaho. And I'm willing to bet that there were tar and feathers trailing after him. So it was a good thing that Kent State University was still churning out young, eager coaches, because that's how Dick Schloop showed up in 1953. Now, Schloop started out slowly. The Bombers just barely improved to 5-13, followed by a 4-12 season. Maybe the players weren't as talented. Or maybe it was because Windham had been kicked out of the Portage County League. And they were the gypsies of Portage County, playing games wherever they could find them. Somebody asked me tonight, they said, how can you play 26 games in one season and then only 15 in the next? And if nobody wants to play you and you don't belong to a league, you play whoever you can get. So that's why these teams had so many fewer games than those 1951-52 teams. Well, I've spoken several times about how Windham became an exempted village school, and that was the cause of Windham being banished from the Portage County League into the wilderness of independence play. Now, some of the county teams continued to play the Bombers, but a large portion of the schedule was against teams that were distant and obscure. But in 1955, things began to change locally. Locally, the political buzz was that Bob Small, and most of you knew Bob Small, was kicked off of the city council, village council, because Mayor Paul Lissick decided since Bob was a public school teacher, he was ineligible to hold public office. Well, council wasn't real happy about that because Bob was popular, he was conscientious. But when Solicitor Roger DiPaolo concurred with Mayor Lissick, they decided that if Bob had to go, so did DiPaolo, and he was unceremoniously fired at that same meeting. Dick Schloop had nursed his Bombers through 2 abysmal seasons, and he felt that they had enough seasoning to be at least competitive this year. After all, he had seniors Ken Rowan, Doug Gooden, Don Wolford, and Lefty Bowers, all with 3 years of his coaching. Sophomore Maurice Jackson would be coming back in January. Now, Maurice had broken his wrist in the legendary football game against the so-called Warren Harding Reserve team, when Warren Harding High School, which was the defending state champion, actually sent their varsity team to play against Wyndham's team. Their varsity featured a kid named Paul Warfield. They went home having lost to Windham 7-6. But Maurice Jackson was injured in that game. He would be out until January. Juniors Don Cottrell, Dave Reniger, and Jerry Tacey moved up from the JV team, as did sophomores Gary Meisner and Wayne Hall. Not a bad team at all. And then 6'2" Tom Denver showed up. Now, Denver had been playing at Belden High School down on the Scioto River. Tom's family left the year after a plant was built in Belden that enriched uranium for atomic bombs. Now, maybe some of that radiation had affected Tom Denver, because he brought a basketball talent to Windham High School that made Coach Schlute's eyes glow. The season opened, as usual, against Hiram on November 29th, the very day that East Germany began building a wall through the heart of Berlin. Schlute expected to beat Hiram, and his team didn't disappoint him. He was glad to get that initial win, though, because Southington was coming to town. You notice the names are starting to change. Southington was coming to town. They were tough. They had a kid named Elmer Campanella who was averaging over 20 points, who had averaged over 20 points a game the year before. Now, Schlute started a young lineup. He had Doug Gooden and Lefty Bowers at guard, Tom Denver at center, and Ken Rowan and Wayne Hall at forward. For the first time ever, the Bombers had 3 boys over 6'2" on the floor at the same time. Rowan drew the assignment of guarding Campanella. 55 years later, sitting in Ken's living room, he told me that he thought he did a decent job that night. No kidding. Campanella scored exactly 0 baskets that night. And Ken and Lefty pumped in 13 points apiece. The entire team shot 50% for the night, and the Bombers dumped the Wildcats 54-49. And that's the night that Dick Schlute decided he had something special in this group of kids. Tom Denver was a coach's dream. His boys ran a fast break any chance they got, but if the break wasn't there, Tom Denver would be. And before long, his scoring average edged up towards 20 points a game. If Denver had 2 men hanging on him, Rowan and Bowers took up the slack, both averaging well into double figures. Gary Meisner began seeing more playing time. Rootstown, Burton, Randolph, and Garrettsville all fell before Christmas. Atwater, the defending PCL champ, took Windham into overtime, and it took 31 points from Tom Denver to pull that one out. In fact, none of the games were really blowouts. And Schlute sometimes put Dave Reniger, who was really just a football player in short pants, he put him in the game to soften up the other team's best player. Dave didn't score much, but the other team knew he'd been there. Well, after Christmas vacation, the Bombers lost 2 straight games. One to undefeated Kent State High School by 3 points. And then they lost to a team from Twinsburg that hadn't won a single game all year. They lost by 2. Dick Schlute had seen enough. He'd lost enough games the last 2 years. He was sick of it. He began pushing his players in practice to be more aggressive. He'd jump into scrimmages himself, just like Clayton West had done. And he'd bully the kids to toughen them up. He said that zone defense was for bloomer girls, which was his term for sissies, and that the Bombers would live or die with a man-to-man, glue-like press. For the rest of the season, Windham became the most frustrating opponent any team could face. That, and skinny Maurice Jackson was back, taking more and more of Doug Gooden's playing time despite still wearing a cast on his hand that resulted in a lopsided jumper. He had to face away from the basket so that the ball would drip this way. Maurice Jackson, for you younger people here, Maurice Jackson was probably the fastest kid who ever wore the black and gold.